So The Descendants, which obviously has turned up majorly in the Oscar nominations, new movie by Alexander Payne, who made Election, Sideways, and About Schmidt, and who has, as we were just mentioning earlier on, has a reputation for making sort of ultra-dry, scabrous depictions of modern urban malaise, characters who are sort of removed from their situation, basically disenfranchised, often fairly well-to-do, middle-aged, facing into the void. The film won Best Film, dramatic film at the Golden Globes, although, frankly, the Golden Globes is increasingly an embarrassment, and it has a Best Picture nomination at the Oscars. This is much gentler than Alexander Payne's previous work. It also seems to be more fated than his previous work. So the story is, it's adapted from a novel by Kyle Hart Hemmings, and it centres around a character who's living in Hawaii and who begins the movie by saying, just because I live in Hawaii doesn't mean my life is any better than anyone else's. So the story is that his wife is in a coma after a boating accident, and he's attempting to deal with, whether or not she'll come out of the coma, and he's suddenly even called to her bedside, having realised that he has to some extent neglected their relationship, and indeed neglected the children with whom he has effectively lost emotional contact. And then a revelation, which I'm not going to give away, a revelation occurs which causes him and his offspring and those around him to go on what's usually described in these things as an emotional journey, both physical and spiritual, in which he tries to draw back together the strands of his life, having discovered that things were not as he thought they would or should be. Now, the things that have been pointed out most regularly about the film is that, firstly, people have said, George Clooney is softer and schlubby around the edges. Isn't it great that Gorgeous George is playing a character who's a kind of middle-aged, slightly baggier, schlubby figure? Although the fact of the matter is as middle-aged, baggy, slightly schlubby goes, I'd still give my right arm to look like...
He doesn't. I know. Seen the poster.
There's schlubby,
like
and
George on
schlubby.
the beach.
He looks, his hair is a little bit raggedy around the edges, but he is still George Clooney, okay? And the film also has a much gentler approach to its characters. Although, whilst the whole thing sort of centres around the figure of somebody who's, is very, very endangered in terms of their physical health, he's in a coma, and everything is spinning out around them, the film still has an essentially gentle, soothing air, which is not something you generally think about as far as Alexander Payne is concerned. There is, at the back of it, a large plot point about a property deal, which is very, very important, at least as far as the machinations of the plot are concerned, but actually, as the film goes on, seems to fade into the background and is sort of resolved in a way which isn't entirely satisfying. So what happens is, you get a narrative which, if you go in there looking for the kind of biting, scabrous, satirical, edgy, often kind of painful thing that Alexander Payne has done in the past, you're not going to get that. Nor are you going to get, although there is much humour in the movie, and there is, despite the fact that one of the characters is in a coma, so you get that kind of hospital bedside humour. It's not the sort of, salt in the wound humour that you would have expected before from Alexander Payne. Now, the strange thing for me was, whilst I was watching the film has a very sort of gentle air to it. And it sort of passes the time in a way which doesn't seem particularly... it doesn't massively emotionally, overthrow you, or it doesn't seem to... It's there. Now, whilst I'm watching the film, I'm thinking, well, this is very ordinary. It's okay, it's fine. The performances are very good, they're very naturalistic, it's being well played, it's well written. One of the things that's beautiful about it, as you heard from that clip, is it has this fantastic music going on in the background, which plays all the way through the film and has a lilting lyrical quality. But the film sort of sneaks up on you, because... what happened was, whilst I was watching it, I thought, this is fine. I'm not entirely sure why it's quite having the lavish praise heaped upon it that it has. I don't think it's Payne's finest work. I don't think it's Clooney's finest work. But when you get to the end of the film, you think, actually, that was really good. And I'm still wrestling with exactly why it is that whilst I was in the company of the movie, I thought it was unassuming and solid and impressive, and maybe too gentle and generous for its own good. But at the end of it, I did find myself. So, there's the last scene, which I won't give away what happens again. It's not a sort of plot twist or anything. But the last scene is a sort of held shot in which you see a sort of moving tableau of the central characters, and it unlike many of Payne's movies, it is moving towards something which actually properly approaches, dramatic and emotional resolution. And it may be that the effect of the end of the film was more profound than I'd thought, and therefore that caused me to reassess the whole of the movie. Or it might actually be that the strange charm of the film is that it works its way into... You know, people talk about films somehow bypassing the intellect and bypassing the thinking part of your brain and going straight and behaving in a way like memory does. And the very, very best films do have that way of... They impinge themselves upon your consciousness without you being entirely sure how. If I'm completely rational and completely analytical about the film, I'd say that it is a softer Alexander Payne film than we've expected in the past. It is a script that has certain contrivances that it never really manages to deal with. Some parts of it look like they're put there mechanically. You can pretty much plan out how the whole thing is going to work out, and it's certainly not something that seems surprising at the time. And yet, at the end of it, my feeling was, actually, that was really good, wasn't it? And I think that it's one of those really odd things that I think the film is better than it appeared at the time, because the more I think about it afterwards, as you try and analyse... You know, people often say, if you go and watch a movie as a critic, are you able to switch off your critical functions and just watch it? And what they're usually referring to is a popcorn movie. What they're usually referring to is a smash 'em up. They're saying, can you enjoy it for what it is, rather than feeling that you have to dissect it? Well, oddly enough, I can't think of a better case of that than in The Descendants, which is not a smash, completely the opposite of that. It's an upmarket Alexander Payne movie, and yet whilst I was watching it, I didn't think that I was that impressed by it. But at the end of it, I suddenly had this kind of way of, actually, I have enjoyed and been involved in that much more than I thought I did at the time. I still don't know that it's up there with, the great... But then again, there's the best film contenders. Remember, the Oscars are the people who once gave the best film to Driving Miss Daisy. But you
said a few things about that over the years.
I know, but you know what I mean by that is that generally they'll go for the blander stuff. The blander something is, the more likely it is to do okay. With the Oscar voters, that's just the way it is. But as far as The Descendants is concerned, even whilst I was watching it and thinking it's soft, it's not the tough Alexander, it's not the Payne that I know and love and admire. At the end of it, there was this very strange feeling of the very final movement, which I think actually may be something which will alienate some people. I think some people will be annoyed by the very end of the film.
Has he got a panther?
A panther turns up and says, "You know what? I don't like this French angsty art porn either." That's exactly what happens.
And it attacks the goose. Gary, listening in a wet Queensland, says. Anyways, he's a huge Clooney film, and that's why he went.
He's a huge Clooney film.
Sorry, Clooney fan, beg your pardon. I have to tell you, it did not start very well. It has a narrator, and we heard a little bit, right, George Clooney.
Because I said instantly, I've got nothing against narrators. One of my favourite, Fernando Trejo was on before, made The Mad Monkey, which is hugely narrated, and I don't have a problem with that.
Gary continues.
When
continues. George Clooney started introducing himself and his situation, I think I let out an audible sigh, and this was straight after the opening credits. I'm still mystified as to why Alexander Payne felt it necessary to have a narration. Anyway, thankfully, this was just the setup, which is good because from there, the film turned out to be quite excellent, really excellent, in fact. It is a beautiful film, almost a perfect film. George Clooney is on top form as Matt King, a man desperately trying to keep it all together and do the right thing even while the rest of his life is falling apart. I laughed and cried, both in good measure and harking back to recent conversation. I never once felt as though I had been manipulated. Alexander Payne, I apologise for calling you an unskillful filmmaker. It might be that Alexander Payne didn't realise that he'd said that. The cast is my favourite film of the past year.
Oh, well, there we go. OK, fine.
The cast were all brilliant, especially the daughters, but Clooney has become a wonderful actor. His choice of roles has been perfect of late, and he is growing in stature with every film. He was at the top of his game in this and fully deserves the Oscar, which I'm sure is coming his way.
He is, as far as I can tell, the bookie's favourite. I mean, that category that he's in for Best Actor, Damien Bashir for A Better Life, actually, that was a surprising nomination. It's terrific, because Damien Bashir is fantastic in A Better Life, which I think was Film of the Week when we did it here. George Clooney for that, Jean Dujardin for The Artist, Gary Oldman for Tinker Tailor, and of course Brad Pitt for Moneyball. I don't think Brad Pitt's got a hope there at all. I think it is going to be between Clooney, Dujardin and Gary Oldman, but I think the bookie's money is on George Clooney.
Gary Murphy also makes the point that the choice of location was very interesting, because it's not often that you see Hawaii. In fact, has it ever been used as an ordinary place with ordinary people, where they born and where people die and people live and people work, and not just surf?
But again, what's interesting about that is that, as he says at the beginning, the idea is that if you're in Hawaii, everything's going to be fabulous. Obviously, Hawaii was Elvis's favourite place. Well, actually, probably one of the reasons, because it was the only place he was able to go that wasn't America, because Colonel Tom Parker didn't have a passport, which is one of the reasons why Elvis wasn't allowed to tour. But is
he still alive?
Who?
Elvis.
Oh, yes.
He is.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, I
yeah.
thought you meant Tom Parker.
No.
Or whose real name was Cornelius Van Huyck.
What about Uncle Tom Cobley?
He was neither a colonel nor indeed a Tom Parker. But that is a nice idea. The idea that Hawaii is thought of as the emotional theme park, that everything is beautiful, the sun is lovely, everyone's surfing, and yet, as he says at the beginning, what you think that we don't have problems here. And I agree. Who was it? Just wrote the email a moment ago that said at the very beginning your heart sinks because you think, oh really?
Gary Murphy in Queensland.
Okay, but actually the film does progress from there in a way, but it's lovely to look at. I mean, the nice thing about it is that you get the sort of the emotional journey stuff, but it is also a very scenic emotional journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that from what you've said and what our correspondent has said, it's a more gritty Hawaii, and it's a Hawaii where people
I think
live
gritty
and
is
die.
overstating it. At no point is there any grit. What there is emotional stuff and baggage and the cogs and wheels and whirs of existence, and
Yes.
at the centre of it is a character looking into the post-middle age void and wondering how on earth he's going to fix his life.
But if you heard that clip where he was saying, people say I live in paradise, but actually this is the reality of my life, and then we
Yes.
look at the poster of the film, and it's George Clooney in his shorts sitting on a beach.
You think, that is paradise, isn't it? Yeah, it's like that bit in Eat, Pray, Love, Vomit, in which he takes her over to the island populated entirely by pelicans. We can just think, yeah, fine, stop complaining.